Hello, my name is Phil Fuoco, and I'm going to be doing a presentation on postcolonialism and its effects on literature. Now, the title of this presentation may raise two questions. The first one is, what is postcolonialism? Postcolonialism refers to the study of the effects of colonialism and imperialism in former European colonies, which are all around the world: Asia, South America, Africa, all those different colonies. It also relates to the embrace and celebration of the original culture of these colonies and the subsequent rejection of colonial ideals that were put in place during this age. Here I have a quote from Edward Said from his book Culture and Imperialism. And it says that imperialism did not suddenly become past once decolonization had set in motion the dismantling of classical empires. So what he means by this is that after imperialism ended and these countries were not under direct European power, this was not the exact end of colonialism, because there was still a cultural impact on these countries from the age where Europe had control over them. And their culture was changed by it, and their cultural identity in general was very skewed by this great change. So the second question that the title of this presentation may raise is the question of how postcolonialism specifically affects literature. And the reason why it does is because many authors from these formerly colonized countries are now rising to popularity, becoming more popular in media, and becoming more accepted, and they're offering their perspectives living in these countries and giving insights as to one, how their culture has changed due to colonization, and two, how they seek to change their state and move past colonial ideals and on to embracing their cultural identity once again. And this has resulted in a big literary movement almost worldwide that is gradually forming, and it's based upon the concept of postcolonialism. One last big question that I'd like to touch on is the question of how authors in this movement seek to deliver their message to people that are reading their literature. And I have deduced three different points, three different examples of how postcolonial authors are seeking to affect the reader and change their perception of their culture. And it is by, one, illustrating their struggles in history; two, by dismissing stereotypes or preconceived notions about culture; and three, by moving away from colonial ideals and towards embracing their own culture before it was affected by colonialism. So let's get right into point one: authors explaining their struggles living in post-colonial countries. One good example of a country with deep struggles and history and all around just a complex concept of culture in general is India. It is a largely multicultural country. There are several different states in India, each with its own language, each with its own culture, each with its own people, and India was subject to colonization from the Age of Exploration onwards by countless different European countries, notably Portugal, England, and many others, but those are the main two. And here I have a quote displaying this, and it is from Umashankar Joshi from his book Modernism in Indian Culture. And it says, "It was Rabindranath Tagore who described in his words his vision of the predicament in which India found herself when faced with the fact of Western civilization after a long spell of isolation, because India geographically is very isolated. There are different mountain ranges. It's a very large subcontinent as well, so there's this separation between the people." Anyways, getting back to the quote, "Never before, perhaps, was India exposed to such a tremendous and aggressively all-pervading influence. It certainly was a very all-pervading influence when European countries came in, bringing this new culture to an already very diverse region such as India." So after this European influence was introduced into India, it introduced many different new concepts that seemed normal from a Eurocentric view, but were very new to these people who had been newly colonized. And one of those was prose in literature, because before then, India had a very largely poetic literary scene, and a lot of their literary forms were nothing similar to any kind of European form of literature. So relatively, prose is a new addition into Indian literature as a whole. And as a result of that, there have been many post-colonial authors from India and during the colonial era which have started to use prose as a vehicle to convey post-colonial notions or just notions about living in India during the age of colonialism and living in a post-colonial age. And one notable author with many works to her name and a lot of critical acclaim is Anita Desai. Anita Desai is a very popular Indian and German post-colonial writer. It says Indian and German, but of course, since there are many different cultures in India, I should clarify she was Bengali and had one Bengali parent, one German parent, and was raised with these two different cultures in her life. She writes fiction stories and has received great acclaim for her works. As I mentioned, she was born into a multicultural and multilingual home. She spoke 4 different languages. She spoke Bengali, Hindi, which is the kind of common language of India, as well as English and German, because of her German parent, as well as the fact that English became a very common language in India after the British colonized it. Her mother was German, and she migrated to India after World War II. So there is also this introduction of a post-war torn family and people migrating to different places after war. So as well as the aspect of colonialism, there's the aspect of war and the effects of war on people. A very impressive fact about Desai is that her first story, which she wrote when she was only 9, was written in English. And mind you, she started writing literature at the age of 7, which is extremely impressive. So Anita's very complex and multicultural upbringing contributes heavily to her perspectives and her stories. She writes a lot of stories that are inspired by her own experiences living in India and living in this great mix of different cultures and languages. There are some quotes from an analysis and from an interview with Anita herself. The first quote says, "It may have something to do with my upbringing and my parents. My mother, having been German, lived most of her life in India and never felt able to return to Germany. As I mentioned before, this is obviously due to World War II and the situation of Germany after the war. And here we have an analysis from Nasrullah Mambrol titled Analysis of Anita Desai's Novels. And it says that her novels since the mid-1990s have continued to explore a concern with imagery built on places, cities that affect her characters who are uprooted or alienated, living away from their homelands and disturbed by their own inner conflicts." And this quote shows how she puts elements of her own life into her literature in some ways, because she would grow up surrounded by, these people, these characters, you could call them, that are uprooted or alienated and living away from their homelands. Obviously, her mother, who was torn away from Germany, and many other people who were moved or alienated due to anything, war, colonialism, things of the sort. All right, so on to point number 2. The second point of how post-colonial authors seek to deliver their message through their writing is by dismissing stereotypes or preconceived notions about their culture. One area of the world that is very strongly subject to stereotyping is Latin America. It is heavily stereotyped, and it has led to a very unique post-colonial literary movement. Obviously, there are very different portrayals of Latin America, and more often than not, the general perspective of Latin America is not true to how life actually is in this part of the world. And the movements that have been founded here seek to redefine Latino culture to the rest of the world. One particular branch of this movement is Macondo. It was started in Chile by an author by the name of Alberto Fuoco, and the purpose of the movement is to display the realities of living in modern-day Latin America, which may strongly contrast with the average, say, European, American, average person who, when they think about Latin America. All right, here we have the quote for Latin America as well as a map. I'm going to be including maps for the different regions of the world I will be talking about today, if that is not already apparent. This quote is from Fukue's "I'm Not a Magic Realist." And it says, sagas of sweaty migrant farm laborers, the plight of misunderstood political refugees, or the spicy violence of the barrio. All decent themes, of course, but quite removed from my middle-class metropolitan Chilean existence. Now, this quote shows the kind of preconceived notions that some people may have about Latin America. It is viewed as this very kind of polarizing place where there are all these refugees coming in from countries, or there is always violence, there's always something happening, and it makes it seem like it's just a crazy region of the world that is kind of affected by violence and poverty. But in reality, there are more developed places in Latin America, be it Mexico City, be it Rio de Janeiro, be it Santiago de Chile, which is where Fuoco is from. So, as I said before, Fuoco is a native to Santiago de Chile, and he wrote many fictional stories. That is his forte, is writing fictional stories kind of based on where he lives in the metropolis of Santiago de Chile. And he tried to attempt to publish his stories in English by going to a conference in the U.S. in Iowa, but he faced discrimination for his works, and they did not believe that it was fitting of a Latin American perspective. So here's a quote from I'm Not a Magic Realist that displays that. He says, "Weeks later, the Iowa Review rejected the first story I submitted to them. In a polite letter, I was gently told that it wasn't what they were looking for. In fact, the story that I written could have easily have taken place right here in America," they said. Now, there's kind of a multi-dimensional aspect to this quote. So first of all, there's kind of the notion that if you're writing about something in Latin America, it should have this kind of, the term that Fuoco likes to use is magic realist, this kind of mythological, romanticized view of Latin America with, all this poverty, this violence, this whatever. And they say that because it's so focused on the kind of everyday metropolitan parts of Latin America, like Santiago, they said that it could have happened in some American city. And the second aspect to this, which you can see kind of lying under, is that they use the term here in America, which in reality, it could be used for North America, South America, Central America. So the use of the term America is kind of loose here, and they're using it to refer to the United States, where in reality, when you look at the hard text, it could just be confirming Fuoco's methods. So Fuoco became aware of the cultural disconnect between Latin America and the U.S., or in some cases Spain or Europe. And he created this movement called Macondo, which is kind of a movement seeking to correct the disconnection, show people that there is certainly a more developed aspect to Latin America, and it is more than, like you said, the migrant workers and the poverty and the violence and everything. So a lot of his future works fall under this movement. All right, so the third and final point I want to touch on today, and the final way that I've come to the consensus of how post-colonial authors seek to display their point, is authors embracing culture. Now, there are many different regions of the world that have very rich and unique cultures, and this ranges all over the world. But one in particular that has a very eclectic and very distinct culture is West Africa. So Nigeria, Senegal, Ghana, Togo, Benin, that general area of formerly French-occupied West Africa. They experienced a large amount of cultural suppression after being colonized, and they were exploited. Of course, every region has experienced its own suppression, but the suppression of West African culture is rather egregious because of the depth of West African culture and the fact that it was almost completely ignored by any of the colonists that came to this region of the world. The colonization, much like India, was very pervasive, and it affected social and artistic culture. And by artistic culture, this specifically is referring to literary culture and writing. So here we have a quote and a map, and this quote is from Karen Barber in her book, African language literature and postcolonial criticism. And it talks about the use of English literature in Africa and how this kind of redefines what literature and literary art means in Africa. And it says, critics of African literature have always taken it for granted that African writers have to write in English. Commonwealth criticism enthusiastically celebrated oral traditional vernacular literatures in Africa, but assumed that modern writers would naturally wish to write in English. So this expresses the sentiment of the fact that there's an expectation for literature to be in English, and the fact that it can only be criticized and equally taken into account if it is in English or some colonizer language. So even though it was celebrated when these artists were writing in vernacular, or if they were writing in their own language, or if they were even using oral tradition, which was the standard form of literary expression before colonization of West Africa. So there were many West African authors that attempted these revivalist movements that were attempting to revive their culture in literature, but they became too convoluted and they became too dense because there was this effort to mix the colonized and colonizers' cultures into one, and it became too dense with the sort of Western abstract methods of literature as well as the West African methods, and it became simply just too convoluted and was not successful. And furthermore, it was criticized by many West African authors. And one notable critic, as well as an author, is Nigerian writer Chinwezu. And he wrote a criticism titled Towards the Decolonization of African Literature. And it was a criticism that pointed out this kind of convolution and pointed out how these modern poets were seeking to mix these cultures. So from Chinwezu and other author Madubuike's analysis, it is very obvious that the revival, it tried too hard to invoke Western abstraction and also trying to employ traditional African poetry, and it ended up creating this kind of lopsided, unstable emulsion of the two, emulsion being a good word to describe it. And this is a rather scathing line from Chinwezu's criticism, and it said, "Into their obscurantist cesspool, the Itaban/Nasuka poets drag everything, foreign images, foreign attitudes and forms, and assorted mannerisms." So this shows how these poets were kind of creating this unstable mix of these two cultures and dragging these foreign images, which did not belong in their art, into their poems. As a result of the criticisms, there is more of an earnest effort in West African literature to be true to culture and embrace it. And now there are several authors, poets, what have you, that are using oral tradition, native languages, and African cultural identity, all things that were in Africa before colonizers and should be embraced and revived. Okay, so now that we've gotten through the 3 points, I would like to conclude and divulge into you an application of how this information can be utilized outside of just a presentation. So to conclude, these post-colonial literary movements are now widespread, almost worldwide, and have appeared in most formerly colonized regions, wherever there are significant literary scenes. And as a result, there's social change being promoted by this new generation, and it is creating a great change in society as a whole. Cultural identity is strengthening, and literature is becoming a more effective vehicle for post-colonialism and all the things that I've said, dismissing stereotypes, embracing culture, explaining the struggles in history, all of those things. So in terms of how you would apply this information outside of just reading this slideshow or listening to my voice is this information could be integrated into high school or middle school literature classes that focus entirely on American or European literature. Although it is important for students to experience American and European literature and kind of see a writer's perspective on different time periods, I feel that they should be exposed to other regions of the world as well. And these curriculums, including literature and studies of movements from these post-colonial nations, could inspire a great social change and could inspire open minds in the school system. Another application could be promoting depictions of accurate culture in media, which this is extremely crucial. Promoting more media that encapsulates pre-colonial and post-colonial culture and educates about the effects of imperialism and colonization. Because many people do not realize the gravity of imperialism and colonization, and learning more about it could change people's worldview and make them more open-minded to different cultures. Another thing is discouraging blatant use of stereotypes. Now, this can't be entirely regulated. Obviously, everyone is entitled to their own opinion and own expression, but especially when it comes to things that are informative, there should be no use of stereotypes or preconceiving anything about any group of people. You should be open-minded and not have any prejudice about any type of person or any preconceptions about them. And to end it all off, these are my literary sources. And here are my image sources. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.